morning. Just wanted to give you a quick tip. If any of you were considering baby chicks, springtime, raising your own flock, getting into your own sustainability, there is legislation in the works right now that's threatening the ability to have fowl, chicks, ducks, whatever, to be shipped across state lines. So that very well could be going away, these hatcheries that get to ship to you via mail or get sent to Tractor Supply Chick Days or to your local feed shops, fresh weekly, daily, day-old chicks. That is being threatened right now. So if you do plan on being more self-efficient, I would suggest you go to your shop and get a list of chicks that are coming in right now and get on it. I have to go pick up some feed, and I was just curious about the chicks and the ducks that are coming into our local feed shop. And there's even a Facebook group for it. And there's supposed to be chicks coming in today. There are already 30 people in line. And they don't even open for another 20 minutes at least. So I just find it crazy business, the world we live in. So please do yourself a favor. And if you need chicks, get on it before that legislation puts a clamp on it.
So you guys just saw an excerpt from Shauna when she was going to get some chicks the other day, and she was talking about legislation, and I want to get to that because we have come across some things that you'll find very interesting. But first, I'd like to hear from Shauna what it's like to go get birds these days, because it seems like it is a pain in the butt.
It's fine. It's more, I don't know. It's a longer process, but a faster process.
So what is it like? Like, what's going on? You get up early to go to these places.
Well, I haven't actually done that yet. I plan to this week. No, because we lost several of our laying hens from a crazy massacre that happened to us twice this last year. We're looking at needing to add to our flock. So because of a compounding issue between a shortage of eggs and the HPAI, there is a need for chicks. And so as a result, a lot of the local feed shops are changing up either how they're delivering day-old chicks. Like, I think Tractor Supply, I haven't actually heard of them saying they're gonna have chick days like they usually do. I don't know if they will or won't. I don't usually go that avenue. Our local feed shop, one of the 2 or 3 that we kind of diversify between, has been having chicks come in, and there are lines. They don't open till 9, and the line begins at 5:50 in the morning to make sure that people can get the chicks that they want. It's chick wars.
It is a little bit like chick wars, but I think if you want to have chicks, it's one of those things where you kind of have to do it now, this time of year, and that's the legislation that I want to get to. But first of all, I'd like to just say it is nice having you on As a Man Thinketh. I don't think our channel has seen you on an As a Man Thinketh before.
Well, no, because it's an As a Man Thinketh.
Well, man, if you actually read the book As a Man Thinketh, which we will do a video on this, man just pertains to a generic term for mankind. It's not transgender, I'm saying. It's just a generic term.
Human civilization in the 1900s, the beginning of.
Yeah, and so you are more than welcome on the show.
Thank you, hon.
Yeah, and I like your hat. Where'd you get your hat?
Well, there's another man. And a woman.
Really? And they gave you a hat?
They gave me a hat. They gave me a whole lot more than a hat.
I don't think I want to know the rest of this. Really?
Yeah. You know who you are.
Okay, so let's move on to this legislation. And I think, this is the type of stuff that's going to impact everybody because, you said HPAI, which is highly pathogenic avian flu.
Blech.
Influenza, yeah. It's a tongue twister. But I would actually argue what we've been experiencing, and if you've watched this channel, I've reported on this several times. One of my videos really dug into the details of why it's unusual, but I would call this the HUPAI, which is highly unusual pathogenic avian flu, influenza. And it's because what we're seeing is this bird flu is hitting more wild species than it normally does. It's normally something that transfers in waterfowl. We've seen it impacting mammals. Most of those mammals have been predators.
Eating dead carcasses.
Eating dead carcasses, although in the scientific community there is concern about it becoming zootonic.
Over the past few weeks, there have been several reports of mammals, including minks, otters, foxes, and sea lions, having been infected with H5N1 avian influenza. H5N1 has spread widely in wild birds and poultry for 25 years, but the recent spillover to mammals needs to be monitored closely. WHO is working with national authorities and partners to monitor the situation closely and to study cases of H5N1 infection in humans when they occur. WHO recommends countries strengthen surveillance in settings where humans and farmed or wild animals interact. WHO is also continuing to engage with manufacturers to make sure that, if needed, supplies of vaccines and antivirals would be available for global use.
The CDC has a vaccine program that they've been working on in case it becomes zootonic. So there's a concern out there for it. I think everybody who studies this knows that what we're experiencing right now is unusual from past breakouts, and it's lasted now for more than a year. So, and it seems to be festering. But part of that could also be just the fact that the way we handle this entire situation is bad. I mean, the testing's bad, and we're going to get into some of that in this video. But the Biden administration, according to CBS News, the Biden administration officials say they have now begun weighing unprecedented shift in the U.S. strategy to counter the outbreak.
We have our indoor cat is outside. I have to go. And this is why I'm not on as a man thinketh.
Welcome to life on the ranch, guys. Anyway, so the Biden administration officials say they have now begun weighing an unprecedented shift in the U.S. strategy to counter the growing outbreak. That's according to CBS News. They didn't cite their sources. It's CBS. They don't have to cite their sources, but we're citing CBS on that. And we don't know what that actually means. But what we do know is that there is a longer-term program that they implemented during the last outbreak. They started doing an environmental impact study. They're working on one now. They've
done several environmental impact studies. They've been doing them since 2000. Did they do one in 2004, or was it 2015 whenever they did their first?
I think it was in 2015, the last outbreak, that they did one, and then they dropped it, didn't they?
No. They've had several. They have done several environmental impact studies that they then either resend or request to modify.
Can I just use her as a source? Is that okay, fact checkers? But anyway, I do know back in 2006, 2005, 2006, there was an outbreak. And at that time, the Bush administration said it's kind of up to the states how they handle it. They didn't want to implement a federal policy over the states on how they would handle the bird flu outbreak, which I
appreciate that.
I can appreciate that as well. And I think that's kind of been the status quo. However, the USDA, so Vilsack, does have a few things that he can do on his own. And those include, hold on a second, I'm using notes today. Under the Animal Health Protection Act, the Secretary of Agriculture is authorized to protect the health of livestock, poultry, and aquaculture populations in the United States by preventing the introduction and interstate spread of serious diseases and pests of livestock, poultry, and aquaculture, and for educating such diseases within the United States when feasible, this authority has been delegated to AFIS. So AFIS, under Vilsack, they have the authority to implement more than they have been doing. But that authority, from what I understand, is limited as far as they can restrict trading of birds. They did that in 2015 when we first wanted to start a flock back in 2014, 2015 during that outbreak. We couldn't buy birds. We couldn't go to a flock swap. We couldn't do any of that. And I think that that's, number one, that's probably going to come back this year. But I also think that...
You hush your mouth. Don't say that.
It's going to happen. I mean, that's one of the basic things that they can do, one of the only tools that they have. And the president can always take his own actions and, with the executive orders and whatnot. We've seen a lot of that recently. And so he could probably expand what that means in an emergency action as far as further restrictions to try and restrict the bird flu. But the bird flu this time around has spread more in the wild bird population than it has in commercial flocks. It's a lot different than 2015. It's highly unusual that it's lasted for more than a season. But because of that, that's where we're going to start running into some of these policy changes.
This is where I freeze as far as what information to give here, because this is a scenario where you have wild bird populations affecting the livelihood of independent people. And there's a piece of you that, you want to protect the pieces of nature that exist, but you also have to protect people. And so it's a matter of national security in that capacity, because you don't want to be too hasty. And I think that the policymakers, as they stand, and the procedures and policies that they've created thus far, have been rather docile, probably because this is a sticky situation. But that lens, where they've left it isn't an answer. The policies that exist, while some could say is an effort to curb the unfortunate situation that is happening right now as far as the avian influenza's reach, there is a significant idiocracy, in my opinion, as far as the fact that it hasn't been readdressed. It hasn't taken on true scientific metamorphosis in regards to appropriate case study and biological change.
Well, let's get into, just real quick, because you were bringing up some good points there. So they are doing an EIS, an environmental impact study. When they talk about environment,
which one?
The current one that they're taking comments on. When they talk about that, part of the reason why they open it for comments with an EIS is to understand the public's viewpoint on the matter. Now, I don't think they actually want comments, because this hasn't been announced anywhere other than I found it on Food and Safety News. I couldn't find any other article referencing this. And normally, you'd be reaching out to the associations for the commercial farmers. You'd be reaching out to all of these groups asking for public comment, unless you don't want the public comment, unless you're just looking for ways to come up with solutions, new technologies, and you don't want the public comment. I think that there's been a lot of distrust over the years, and if there's distrust in the process, this is the time when people can actually go there and voice their opinions, be heard, and they have to take that into consideration. And I think that as we get into this conversation, there is significant distrust out there. There's also a lot of concerns. I mean, we have extraordinarily high egg prices. We have pork prices are going higher with the population of cattle in the U.S. dropping. Other sources of protein like beef are getting more expensive. So there's a lot that I think that anybody from the public can weigh into on this conversation, and absolutely should, because it impacts everyone. And I think when we start and when we talk about some of the testing and stuff, you'll understand, just how ridiculous some of the stuff is. But anyway, part of the reason why we wanted to do this video is because this concerns us. We have birds, we're trying to grow our flock right now. I've advised many of you to try and grow your flocks before the spring, knowing that there's going to be something coming that's going to restrict that this year. I mean, the springtime is a very big concern for the government when it comes to this disease spreading. And so we have started to look into some of these policy changes. And while we can't figure out what CBS was talking about, because that was more of an immediate thing, we have looked into this EIS report and the public comments on it. And from what I understand, this report is something that's going to impact the future for a very long time, policy going forward, because it's going to take a while to go through these studies and make recommendations back to the USDA. But and Shauna has done a lot of research on this as well. We both kind of read through it. I think that there are different types of action plans. Some of it they'd like to be able to just have the authority to use new technologies if they feel it's less risky than harming the environment. But the thing that we found concerning is that there have only been 13 comments. And like I said, I don't think that they put it out there really to get public comments. They have to do that by law. They have to make it available for public comment, but it hasn't really been announced to the public that it's open for comment, and that ends on Friday. So this is your chance to go and voice your opinion. We're going to give you some topics here. We also, in reading one of those comments, Shauna was able to contact a farmer, and I'll let you kind of explain, the background on that and what people are going to be able to see this afternoon on our channel.
Yeah, so in reviewing the Department of Agriculture's registry of notices, whenever we were reviewing the overall synopsis of what they presented and then opened it up for commentary, the 13 comments, there were several that made me chuckle. And then there was one in particular where it was a rather sad story of how this HPAI has actually rather devastatingly affected a particular farm, a small commercial farm that's in Washington State. And so I contacted Elaine with Hearth and Haven Farm and was able to have a conversation with her about what transpired with them specifically. And what really struck me was not that they were going through this ordeal, because it's, when you deal with nature, you deal with a whole slew of variables. But what struck me was that under the current regulation, the state's policy of Washington State, they required a culling of all of their birds, even though they had made it through a significant period of time in which the animals were doing better. They were thriving, some would say. They were on their way up. And rather than utilizing that information in a positive light to encourage knowledge and encourage opportunity for a small farm to get back on its feet, the whole culling was called for, which leads into, okay, what are these tests that they're doing? Are they sufficient? Is it sufficient enough that any governing body can demand of a free American that they obliterate their way of life? In my opinion, no. So it kind of gets to the heart of a lot of things that I think a lot of people in this world right now, America, the world, are being impacted in ways that you have to question who has the right to dictate these things to you. Are they being responsibly done? And the impacts, the effects, the long-term changes that have to take place as a result of that is shaking, it's moving, and so.
Well, and I think, a lot of people are concerned about what's going on. They feel like there's a lot of distrust, which I understand why. There's a lot of reasons to distrust processes. If I were to submit a comment on this, which we probably should since we're doing a video on it, but if I were to submit a comment on this, I would probably make the suggestion that we improve our testing. You know, a lot of people are talking about CPR tests, they're inaccurate. When it comes to COVID, we could test somebody and know if the virus is active, if they're contagious, etc. And then at the same time, if they've had COVID, antibodies show up. Well, when it comes to the avian flu and they do a test, all they see are the antibodies. And from what I'm understanding, is that what you're understanding?
There was a study done in Pennsylvania, or a protocol released, that was discussing the testing of the avian influenza. And frequently in most studies, they cannot determine not only whether it's active and shedding or if it's inactive. They designate the antibodies, but they cannot tell much beyond that. They can't tell if it's HP or if it's LP, which that stands for high versus low. So the level of risk you're incurring, whether it's high alert or not. And then there was a study, or part of that same article stated that there were instances in which they could tell more, but it's very rare because it's expensive and most places aren't equipped to be able to test those kinds of variables.
So, exactly, but that's my point, is if we can't test it fully and we don't know what it is we're dealing with, if a flock had recovered, or in this case, it sounded like her birds were in recovery. Their ducks, waterfowl, can actually recover pretty well from this disease. And, we talk about the risk to domestic chickens, but most of the time we just fry them all with CO2 gas, and instead of being able to determine what actually happens. There's got to be a better way of testing to know more than just antibodies, and know if these birds are in recovery, and know if there is any type of risk there or not. I mean, this is something where it's kind of like, at this point in time, come on, you gotta pick up the game here a little bit and test this stuff. We have a food insecurity issue. We have a protein shortage in general, and we're just gassing 100,000 birds at a time.
Well, maybe that's what Biden's administration's about to talk about.
I don't know if I'd put that much credit in there.
I see you.
I think what they're about to talk about is the history of the administration has been typically more regulations, whether they make sense or not. That's my concern with it.
Can I say no comment?
Yeah, you can say no comment. Do you really think that they would be coming out with new ways to test? My understanding is that they're currently approving vaccine studies on birds.
No, they're getting ready to think about possibly doing. Don't forget all those words.
Yes. So the wording is,
blah, blah, blah.
Federal scientists are gearing up to test the first vaccines on poultry against bird flu.
Gearing up.
Yes, they're gearing up. And although it could take years for vaccine approval, because they have to understand the full impacts of that vaccine, side effects with the birds, side effects with people eating it, and what all of that means, they could get emergency approval to push it through faster.
And yet they're still ignoring instances like this farm, where they submitted themselves to be a willing case study, to be a quarantined option for natural immunity. Natural immunity. Why isn't that being addressed? Why isn't that being recognized? And why is there an immediate cold motion in order? I understand that it's state specific, and I appreciate the freedom of that. I don't appreciate blind culling. It's just incredibly.
Well, I think it comes back to that testing. I mean, they're testing the birds. They have no idea if the bird is in recovery, if the bird has fully recovered from the virus, because it can still carry the antibodies for a period of time. They just know that the bird has come in contact with the virus, and that is.
And so as a result of insufficient conclusive evidence, they will starve communities.
Yeah, pretty much.
They're going to fight a big bad boogeyman on not inconclusive evidence. And they'd rather ruin lives and communities just in case, as opposed to thoughtful, conclusive research. Sounds like another virus I've heard of recently.
Yeah, it does actually. Anyway, guys, today we're going to play for you guys the entire interview that Shauna had with this duck farmer. She's going to talk about some of the signs that she saw with the ducks, what it was like going through this whole experience, including talking about the way the ducks were acting and behaving the day that the government state came in to cull her entire flock. And this
Government state?
Well, it's a government. It's a state government.
Okay.
But I mean, the point is that this happened to them. They've seen how it all works. They've experienced it firsthand. They have suggestions for how to manage your flock, how to keep an eye out for this. Just a lot of good content that I think you'll find in that interview. And we're going to air it this afternoon, at probably around 3 p.m. So stay tuned for that. And hopefully it's educational for you. Are there any other hot topics in that interview that I'm missing that they might be interested in hearing about?
She also talks briefly about the differences between a small-scale commercial farm and large-scale commercial, and some of the challenges that are a part of that dynamic. Policy is put in place to protect the large farmer because we've transitioned away from a more conventional small-scale agrarian community to being large-scale production so that people can go and be doing other things other than subsistence. So these smaller scale farms, legislation isn't representative completely of them. And so that's where they get hit.
My understanding of this too is that they can't utilize the land where they think the ducks could have been, which on a small farm that lets their animals kind of range freely, that could be a very large area. Mm-hmm. So they can't utilize any of that, except for, I think she said they could use goats in that space for about 120 days. That's their state's law. So that's devastating for a farm. It's
not just the fact that it's just any farm. It's specifically, these guys are egg production. She'll break it down for you this afternoon, the timeline and the actual length of impact, because unless you understand specifically that type of production and the term of, like, you have to think about growth, production, distribution, an entire life cycle of things that change and kind of get screwed up because of...
But I'm just thinking of unused acreage too in general. That's a good point, but just the unused acreage that you can't use for anything else. They pretty much are limited on what they can do with that space during a period of time where you'd have to get it going for the next year. So then it just shuts you down for an entire year, because if you can't prep it in the springtime for another animal, whatever it is, it's just lost. Whereas in a commercial chicken house, a lot of guys will have 5 or 6 chicken houses. It hits one house, the other houses test fine. They CO2 that house and they bleach it out and they shut it down for a period of time. But it's not going to impact their entire farm. It's not going to impact every area of the farm where the animal that was free-ranging could have gone. So anyway, I hope you guys tune into that this afternoon, listen to the whole interview, and take a moment and send some comments in on this. If you disagree with the way that they're testing for these things, if you disagree with the way that they're handling it, make it known, because they still might not listen to your comments, but at least people will be commenting on future legislation. As for immediate action, there's no telling what's going to happen. We know what the USDA is capable of doing. We also know what executive orders can do, and there's a lot of things that could happen between now and the spring. My suggestion would be, if you are concerned about restrictions, to go ahead and take some of those actions now in building your flock.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just keep in mind that if you don't exercise your free right to vocalize opinion.
But that's not free. We don't have that right.
You do have the right to make a comment. You do have the right to write an email, write a letter, send something to the representatives and the powers that be. If they choose not to listen, well, then that's what different elevations of change are for. But for people who complain or are whining or fussing about things that are happening to them, and yet they do not take a singular step towards vocalizing themselves, and I don't mean disrespectfully, I mean in the appropriate avenues in which you can get the most, I guess, the most exposure possible, then you don't have a right to speak. And then you're just giving it away. So if you want to live in the land of the free, start making it free again, right?
Yeah, vocalize your opinion on this stuff and make it known if you have issues with how this is going. I mean, this is something, like I said, it impacts every single one of you. This duck farm was producing eggs that people who relied on eggs that didn't come from chickens, from allergies and everything else. I mean, they were reliant on this farm. It's not just this, like a small farm shut down. It shut down parts of that community. It took away resources of that community. And it probably could have been, on some levels, prevented. They probably could have been up and operating sooner. And because of the way things are, they may never go back into egg production.
There's no probably about it. Had the state been a little bit more proactive in their initiative to want to truly resolve the issue, as opposed to just fear of the unknown, kill the unknown. Like, when has that ever worked? I mean, they'd at least be able to have some kind of experimental starter flock, a foundation, as opposed to literally a reset button with a delay of 4 months. Delayed reset button.
Yeah. So 3 o'clock today, tune in, check out the video. You'll learn a lot from her. It'll answer some of your questions that many of you have had about being able to spot disease, how to manage it, how to prevent it. I've always suggested to people that they have 2 different flocks on their property, and just try and do your best to keep them out of areas where wild birds like to hang out. And be wise, be careful, and be heard.
It's a good slogan. The only thing I would say is don't be silent.
You might get persecuted for it, but don't be silent.
Not if your faith is in the right place. Mm-mm.